Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back. So excited because we have a woman with us who has been out there on the front lines doing what I think we're all here to do, but sometimes we may lose sight of, and that's to help people, help make people happier and healthier. It's really not about any agenda. It's not about seeing whose science can beat up who else's science. It's about enabling people to live better lives. And that wonderful woman is Nora Gedgaudas. She is the author of a wonderful book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, which is all about going beyond the paleo diet and finding something that's wonderful for you to enable you to live your best life. And also the proprietor of the website of a similar name, primalbody-primalmind.com, a stand-up woman, a wonderful researcher, a great author, and just so thrilled to have you on the show. Nora, welcome.
Oh, John, thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure because I really think that individuals such as yourself, I mean, I'm intentionally generous with that introduction because truly you are doing, I mean, I'm going to get a little wax philosophical here for a second because I was just talking with my family on the phone and I was just talking about how nutrition, and they're like, man, you are into this, Jonathan. I was like, what I'm into is I'm into not watching people die. And I don't want to be morbid, but some of the stuff you're seeing, like I just got forwarded this documentary that's coming out of Brazil about what's taking place in Brazil with improper diet and nutrition. And I cannot wait for this video to go viral because it absolutely will. And it is just heartbreaking. And you're one of those individuals who are out there on the front lines, enabling people to literally save their own life, save themselves from this environment that we're being brought up in. And I kudos to you for that.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I mean, what's overwhelming to me and what I'm exposed to day is, the incredible range of suffering. It's absolutely palpable to me. And I get a couple hundred emails a day from all kinds of people. And I get really exciting emails from people who've been implementing things that they've read in my book for some time now and are seeing all kinds of dramatic changes that they're just so excited to share with me, and it's thrilling to hear. But then I have, new people, maybe they've just read the book, or they're confused, or they're lost, or they're just, or they just heard something about me and they thought that they would try to reach out. And of course, I can't respond to all of these folks. I just can't, be doing, free consultations over email. But I'm constantly sort of monitoring what's happening out there, and what's happening isn't good. It is really an immense amount of suffering, of a lot of problems that people are having. Everything from, weight, metabolic issues, and immune system problems, and mood issues, mood-related things, psychiatric disorders, all the stuff that people just don't even know how to identify. It's things like, look, this and this and this are going on with me. Nobody's ever been able to figure this out, and I can't live this way anymore. And it's epidemic. It's everywhere.
And it's unfortunate because it's becoming the new normal. There's this assumption that we all know, there's this assumption that taking all these medications and not being able to sleep, it's just part and parcel, or maybe it's even thought of as a badge of honor. Like, look, I can deal with all of this stuff. And also what has become so commonly accepted is that this is so complicated and this is so hard to be healthy. And like, we're trying harder and harder and harder. I mean, if you go to Europe, for example, and you see how they perceive food, and you see how they perceive going to the gym, in quotations, and then you look at their disease rates and their obesity rates, you're like, wait a second, how are these people not trying as hard and doing so much better? And while we try harder and harder and harder and get worse and worse and worse, what's going on here, Nora?
Well, as long as the Europeans are sticking to their more traditional diets, they are doing better. But of course, increasingly with multinational corporate, influences, changing the way food is grown and changing the way food is advertised, changing the way food is accessed. Things like this are changing in rapidly in Europe as well and elsewhere in the world. So we're kind of on our own a little bit, with respect to having to be responsible a little bit more for our own health and well-being. If you're leaving your health and well-being as a responsibility of some other authority figure, or if you're trying to, sort of trust the media to tell you, you're unlikely to get what's best for you so much as what's best for whatever financial interests that they might have. So we're all kind of having to make choices now, where in the past, those choices came very naturally. Our very ancient ancestors didn't have these problems. They didn't ask these questions. For them, the grocery store was whatever they walked out the door and into the woods to find.
Mm-hmm.
They consumed whatever plants might have been available, given whatever time of year it was or period in our climatic history. They enjoyed a very wide variety of animal source foods and seafood and all kinds of things. And they just simply they weren't concerned about saturated fat and cholesterol, and they also didn't have running shoes and gym memberships.
Mm.
They did what came naturally to them, and it served them incredibly well for an incredibly long period of time. And by the way, these ideas that somehow our ancient ancestors died when they were they died when they were 30, so therefore they didn't live long enough to develop these diseases. That's really a myth. The average age of mortality that gets talked about sometimes in this context is just exactly that. It's an average age of mortality, which also includes things like infant mortality,
Mm-hmm.
Which ends up, skewing these numbers quite a bit. The fact of the matter is that our most distant Paleolithic ancestors, from 3 million years on up to about 10,000 years, that they were capable of living every bit as long a life as we do today, only they did it without chronic and degenerative diseases.
Mm-hmm.
So the more we can go back and repeat what they did, by far the better off. That's the simplest thing you can do to radically improve the way you feel and function in the world.
Well, I love that you brought up those, let's get the facts on the table about this whole, well, our ancestors didn't live as long as we do. So hold on a second here. Anyone who says that, hold on a second, because we have diabetic children. We have teenagers that are having heart attacks. Okay. So if your 6-year-old is pre-diabetic, there's no oh, well, they didn't live long enough. That just shows what's going on here. Really transcends these flippant arguments. And I think it's also important just to note that why push back on something when what we're doing right now is so clearly not working? What do we risk by moving away from what we've been doing for the past 40 years? It's not like it's working.
Right.
So what are people fighting against? I don't get that.
Well, and I think what people are fighting against are their taste preferences and perhaps to some degree their addictions to foods that, by the way, have been designed to be addictive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's probably not a single multinational corporation on the planet right now that isn't heavily invested in every single man, woman, and child on this planet being dependent on carbohydrates. In other words, sugar and starch as a primary source of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
It's cheap, it's profitable, and it keeps you hungry. and it keeps us, it keeps people malleable. They're constantly looking for, where that next handful of fuel is coming from to keep their fire burning. Where if you were instead dependent on fat as your primary source of fuel, the way we were actually designed, eating becomes more of a choice, and you're able to make healthier choices because you're not craving constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big difference. And it's kind of it's a potentially threatening difference, not to get overly conspiracy theorist, but, logically and rationally, it is a potentially threatening thing for the public to be making smart choices.
Oh, absolutely. And to those who would bring up thoughts of conspiracy theory, it's not let's just pop out a level here. I think we can all agree that if you, I mean, just put yourself in the mind of someone who sells pharmaceuticals or who sells food products and needs to distribute on a national scale. If an individual is sick, okay, you can sell them things to make them better. And if an individual, and if you're trying to sell food, would you rather have to sell things that spoil within a matter of days, need to be refrigerated throughout transportation, or would you rather be able to mass produce homogeneous things that can be shipped all around the world? And I mean, let's not make claims about whether or not those people are evil or not, but just from a rational perspective, if your goal is to make money, sick people who eat primarily starches and sweets are, fact, more profitable than healthy people that eat primarily fresh things you could just find in nature.
Right. And that's just plain logical for anybody willing, to be honest with themselves about it. But, we've been conditioned to think of food as this nutrient devoid source of entertainment. Mm-hmm. And food for us is supposed to be tasty. It's supposed to be exciting. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be part of our whole social, context. And we don't think of it as being primarily something designed to nourish us. And by the way, you can have extraordinarily nourishing, far more nourishing food, that in my view tastes a heck of a lot better. And in fact ends up being less expensive in the long run, even in and of itself, not even counting the savings on your medical bills. But we're not conditioned to necessarily to think of whole, unprocessed foods that way. They're not advertised.
Oh, Nora, and you hit the nail on the head there, because that's like, if you go into a gourmet restaurant, like if you look at traditional French cooking, for example, in many instances, these are made with few high quality, very natural, very fresh ingredients. It's not, this is in no way, shape or form about deprivation. In fact, the things that we are wired to crave, like the taste of sweet and salty and the fatty taste and the more meat, or I think it's umami or whatever, maybe know the word.
Right.
Yeah, like those things are all available to us in this more, I like to call it both ancestral and very modern way of eating. Ancestral because it's borne out by our ancestors, and modern because the modern nutritional research backs it completely. This is a delicious way of eating, and a way of eating that we can do forever. It's not like no sweets or no fats, or it's just get those from the right places.
Yeah, right. I think the myth that gets me the most frustrated and the most angry, and that is the most wrong, is also the idea that in order to eat a healthy diet, you have to be wealthy. Mm-hmm. And I have a good friend that wrote an ebook that I actually have available for sale on my website called Primal Tightwad. And one of the things, so she basically outlined all the ways in which you can get by so cheaply. This is a person, by the way, who can live comfortably on about $20,000 a year. She owns her own house almost outright at this point. She does whatever she pretty much wants. She has a lot of days a week off because she has figured out how to make the most of every dollar that she spends. She literally keeps track down to the penny every single month what it is she spends on food. And I got on bended knee because she eats, the diet that we're talking about, the one that I advocate specifically in my book. And so I got on bended knee and I said, would you please write a book about this? Because she was going on and on about how much money she saves eating this way. And so she did, and it's brilliant. But one of the wonderful things that she did was that she took a week's worth of menu from the standard American diet. We're talking about your hamburger helpers and your, trips to McDonald's and your sodas and your, all your chips and whatever. And she calculated down to the penny, 1 tablespoon of ketchup, 2 cents, or whatever, calculated all out and totaled it up at the end of the week. Now, this was all for one person. And then she went for another week and created another week's worth of menus based on the information in my book. And at the end of that, each of those weeks, it was actually less expensive to eat the way that I talk about. Not only that, but it literally worked out to being calculated out to being $1,500 per person per year cheaper.
Wow.
It is a total myth. See, a lot depends. People assume that if you're going to eat well, you have to go, places like Whole Paycheck or, not to name names, but that there are a lot of expensive and sort of boutique natural food stores that put high price tags on food items. And that's not your only choice. There are many, many ways of obtaining these foods that are extremely affordable. And you can get together with family and friends and other neighbors and things like that. And you can pool together and go out to these farms and do CSAs or maybe buy a cow together from a rancher who's raising the animal in a healthy, organic, grass-fed sort of way, and then split it up amongst yourselves. And it works out to be pretty cheap per pound when you do it that way. There are, shopping farmers markets, shopping natural food cooperatives, which are kind of a dying breed, but they're still around and they're worth seeking out. I wish there were more of them, and I hope that there will be. But, thinking in terms of community, joining organizations like the Weston Price Foundation, which has different chapters in pretty much every city in the country now, you can connect with those groups, and they have weekly potlucks and things like that where you can go and connect with other people trying to make positive changes in their health. And you can, share ideas and share recipes. There are all kinds of ways of doing this in a way that is fun, that is easy to do, and that is affordable.
Absolutely. When you approach it from a conscious perspective, which I think is just a great way to approach life in general, just like be conscious, think about what you're doing. If we approach it from that perspective, there is no question we can find ways to make this not only affordable, but more affordable. And again, let's just get back to logic. The people who are selling the traditional cookies and cakes and whatever, the point of selling those products is to extract as many dollars and cents as possible. And I don't mean, again, it's not about a conspiracy theory. It's about saying, for example, you basically know how much, let's say, spinach and a pound of grass-fed beef should cost. Like it's a commodity. You should know how much it should cost. But if I can invent like the Whizzledings and I can charge you whatever the heck I want for them, because you don't know what a Whizzleding is supposed to cost, and it sure tastes good. So
sounds delicious.
And even the internet, I found for me personally, you'd be surprised how much you can get wonderful things delivered to you just, with dry ice and such in bulk quantities. So it's very affordable. And even things like, while canning is probably not the best thing ever, it's certainly better than the standard American diet. And again, like if we could get vegetables right out of the field, that would probably be ideal. But some of these options that are flash frozen are certainly going to be better for us than a lot of these other things available to us.
Yeah, look, our ancestors never would have thought to get their meal out of a cardboard box, and yet we're trained to think that that's the way it's supposed to come now.
Mm-hmm.
This is all conditioning. Look, corporations have but one obligation, and that's to their investors. That their obligation is, their primary incentive is profit. It isn't your health or well-being. It isn't to create a healthier, more natural or whatever product. They'll say whatever they have to get you interested in creating profit for them. So, you have to become savvy enough to be able to read between the lines, know how to read labels and understand the message, and better yet, avoid purchasing too many things that actually require labels. Exactly. Although certain things should require labels, and that's genetically modified foods, which we could all start foaming at the mouth over. But the fact is that, healthy food mostly resides around the outside edges of the grocery store. And the more you can avoid the central aisles in your average grocery store, the better off you're going to be.
And what I love about what you're doing, Nora, is this isn't so much about, what I don't hear you saying, and what I'm not saying either, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is it's corporations are bad and these are evil people, because in some ways, right, people sell what people buy. And we've already seen, like, for example, with the green movement, like as consumers started to demand more green things, people who are interested in making money said, well, the only way we can make money is by providing things that are more environmentally friendly. But the thing that is key, and the thing I think we do need to watch out for and we do need to be militant about, is I like to use the analogy of smoking, where nobody smokes today thinking that they're doing anything other than killing themselves. And no one gives cigarettes to their children thinking they're doing something good for their children. However, the nutritional dialogue has gotten so discombobulated that often people are eating things that they believe are healthy and are actually not. And that's where I think it's really that empowerment and that education that is so important, because if truly, I mean, I hope people don't hear this and they think, oh my God, we're all just victims. We vote with our dollars every day, and where the dollars go, the people selling stuff will follow. But we first have to get educated so that we can know how to allocate our dollars properly.
Right. And right now, 90 cents out of every food dollar is actually being spent on processed food, or shall we say food-like substances. Mm-hmm. And so that needs to change. And the more we can become individually responsible for our own health. Look, nobody will ever care more about your health and well-being than you. And so it's a matter of basically, taking responsibility for your own health and well-being in a way that, where you're making the choices. You recognize that you're making a choice every time, you spend $1 on anything in any grocery store or any restaurant or whatever else, that so that you make the best possible choice for your own health and well-being and the health and well-being of your family. And you're right. I'm not saying that everybody that operates within the framework of corporations, and even these big, huge multinational corporations, are evil. I actually have close friends that have spent time within some of the very high echelons of some of the very biggest of these corporations. And I'm here to tell you, they don't all necessarily understand that what they're doing is bad. They're just everything is very compartmentalized within these corporations. They're all kind of doing their own thing. And they don't necessarily have an awareness that what they're selling is necessarily killing people. But, you're not terribly likely to get accurate information from the mainstream media or mainstream educational sources, really. A lot of these things are really controlled by these corporate interests who have a vested interest in you wanting to buy from them. And so you really have to use your own common sense here. And in my mind, if it wouldn't have looked like food to somebody wandering around 40,000 years ago with a loincloth and a spear, or a pair of mucklucks, as it were, it's not food for us now either. And that to me is the simplest way to think about it. Every time you go and you look at a label or whatever, would an ancestor, 50,000 years ago or whatever, would they have seen this as food?
And I love that focus on food, because even getting back to the corporations not necessarily knowing they're doing something bad, as soon as we made a shift as a culture from thinking about food to thinking about calories, it becomes very easy to do things which are very bad for people without even knowing what you're doing is bad. For example, if you just think that the body is a mathematical equation and it's just about having the same number of calories in as you get out, and that's all that matters, well, then it is totally reasonable for Coca-Cola to say, guys, a Coke only has 180 calories in it or whatever.
Right.
It's only 180 calories. Seriously, calm down. Why is everyone freaking out? And if they actually believe what we're all taught, which is really just a calorie, it's just about eating less, that is a totally rational position to have. But it's not about calories. It's about food. And clearly a can of Coke isn't the same as spinach. They're not, those foods are not the same. But when we turn it into a math problem about lowest common denominator, everything has calories, that's when things get complicated and go off the rails.
Well, look, the whole calorie theory assumes that we basically function like a heat engine, and we're not a heat engine. We're a chemical factory. So when we take in calories from proteins, fats, or carbohydrates, they're not necessarily utilized in the same way. Mm-hmm. And a greater percentage of certain macronutrients might be inclined to be utilized as calories than others. Look, fat and protein primarily go to structure first. Structure, hormones, neurotransmitters, cell membranes, maintaining all of these things throughout our body, where carbohydrates really, carbohydrates are basically, less than 1% of our, maybe 2% of our entire physical structure is actually made up of carbohydrates. And we don't have to eat any in order to generate those. You can make all of the glucose and all of the other, glyconutrients that you need from a combination of protein and fat in your diet. You don't ever have to eat it. So every molecule of carbohydrate, for instance, sugar and starch, in other words, that you eat over and above what you need to outrun a charging rhino right now, is much more likely to get stored as body fat on you than actually fat would. Mm-hmm. Because fat is used for far more things. Look, your brain by dry weight is roughly 80% fat. And so your brain and nervous system have to have fat in order to function well. They have to have cholesterol in order to function well. And we've been eating those things, by the way, for a little over 3 million years now. And to no apparent detriment, until apparently recently.
And that worked out well.
but I'll tell you, the number one source of fat calories right now in the American diet is actually partially hydrogenated and genetically modified soybean oil. Mm-hmm. I think canola oil is probably running a close second on that. Mm-hmm. And those are foods that were never available to our ancient ancestors. They would not know what those things are.
And Nora, that is such a critical point, because I frequently get asked questions of, well, there was this study over here where the higher fat group had these problems and the lower fat group didn't. But when you look at the study and you look at where the higher fat group was getting their fat from,
right,
they would obviously have terrible health problems because they weren't eating high quality natural fats. They were eating, yes, if you eat more French fries fried in high temperature vegetable oil, you're gonna have all kinds of problems.
Well, and it's true. And a lot of times those studies don't take into account either what else you were eating besides that fat, mm-hmm. right? So, if you're eating a high starch diet along with that fat, it's much more likely to cause you problems than if you were eating a fat rich diet that largely excluded sugar and starch. Mm-hmm. It's very, very different.
Well, and I love what you were saying earlier about protein and fat and carbohydrate just being different in the sense that we've all heard of essential amino acids. We've heard about that. We need them. They're essential. We've all heard about essential fatty acids. We need them. They're essential. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate.
That's right. Of the three macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, the only one for which there is literally zero human dietary requirement is carbohydrate. And we can get all of the glucose we need from that combination of protein and fat in the diet. We don't ever have to consume it, ever.
And folks, that's not just Nora or Jonathan Bailor's opinion. Like, even the document, the USDA recommended whatever, it's this like 1,200 page document, and it's what the guidelines, the pyramid, the plate, basically all curriculum, the American Dietetics Association, it gets all based on what this document says. That document acknowledges that there is no absolute requirement for humans to consume carbohydrate. And it says, it's funny because when it says it, it's like apparently, comma, blah, 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 like as if it is like reticent to admit that, but it does. It even says there is no absolute human requirement. So I always like to think of carbohydrate, food that is basically mostly carbohydrate, as an effective delivery mechanism for essential vitamins and minerals. So then you have to say, like, if I'm going to eat a food which is primarily a carbohydrate, let's eat the foods that do provide essential things. So things like non-starchy vegetables are great sources of essential things along with those non-essential carbohydrates, but things like sugar provide nothing essential, nothing. It's just waste, and it causes hormonal badness, so it's bad on many fronts.
Yeah, just don't even get me started on all the bad things that causes. But yeah, I actually think that fibrous vegetables, for instance, and greens are probably far more important to us now than they were to our distant ancestors, because one of the things that I explore in my book is the fact that the world that we live in now is very different from the world of our ancestors. We're in a far more stressed out and toxic environment than they ever could have imagined. We have things that are impacting us daily and affecting us daily that our ancestors couldn't have even begun to have imagined. And so I think that a lot of the phytonutrients and antioxidants that are present in these fibrous vegetables and greens are much more important to us now, perhaps in some ways, than they ever used to be. And so, in my mind, yeah, eat as many of those as you want for bulk and for their antioxidant value and phytonutrient value. But where sugar and starch is involved, in my personal view, and there's a lot of controversy about this, but in my personal view, there's no requirement for any of that whatsoever.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And Nora, I want to make sure we have time because there is a page on your website which I think should be required reading for just like when you get your driver's license, they should say, here's this page. You need to go read this because it's your top 10. Let me make sure I'm saying this correctly.
Mm-hmm.
It's the
nutritional mistakes. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And I don't think we have time to go through all 10. I could talk to you for days.
To the website to look them over.
Well, the one that I wanted to focus on, because there's two, but I don't think we have time. I'll have you back on the show. We can talk about them both. But I want to talk about myth or item number 8, which is believing that junk food in moderation is okay. Let's talk about that. Nora, isn't it just all about moderation? Like if you go on any major talk show, Nora, they're going to say, well, that was nice, Nora, but it's just about moderation, isn't it?
Right. And you know what? That's very PC. That is, the nutritional politician's mantra, the one who wants to make everybody happy because it helps people rationalize their bad habits. But how much metabolic chaos and inflammation and immunologic reactivity or compromise to your health do you really want to enjoy in moderation anyway, And so I think that, again, with what I just mentioned about a lot of the stresses that we're exposed to today, and nobody's exempt from these stressors in our environment. And I can go on listing them, all day long. In my personal view, again, I think that what we're left with is almost no room for error in terms of what we need to do to try to remain, to try to maintain any semblance of health, much less be optimally healthy. We're all either getting better or worse every moment of every day with every choice that we make. And so, if you can't afford, like for instance, right now, the number one source of bankruptcy in the United States is a bad diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So if you can't afford that bad diagnosis, and I don't know who can, then you can't afford not to eat optimally well. And you're going to have to do a little homework. In my view, I think it's really important to have some understanding of all of this. You don't have to have a PhD level understanding. This isn't hard, but it's basic information that we've never been asked to really understand before. We've always just sort of trusted whatever the authorities had to say. I think it's time we start trusting ourselves and that we start going and doing just a tiny little bit of legwork, a tiny little bit of research, read my book, read, anything John Bailor has to say. And absorb the common sense of that and understand that the choices that you make, every time you pick up a fork are going to either take you closer to health or further away from it.
And
it's as simple as that.
And what Nora just said, which is so critical, is like doing that little bit of legwork. The other thing, Nora, the angle that I love about this as well is, people will come back and they'll say, I have friends who eat like garbage and they live to their 120 and they never had any problems. And the thing I would say back to those people is there are people that smoke and never get lung cancer too. That doesn't mean we should recommend smoking. And that's the key thing. I think what we're talking about here are like recommendations. Like what should the USDA be recommending that we do? And the recommendation should not include garbage in moderation, just like the recommendation to your children isn't only smoke during social occasions. It's
right.
Smoking is bad. So the extent that you can avoid it is good.
Right.
So, and that's the message with these. No, they're bad. And that doesn't mean that if you eat it once, you're going to die, but they are bad and they will do to your metabolic system what smoking does to your respiratory system. So just like you try to avoid smoking as much as possible, you should try to avoid these things as much as possible. What do you think?
Right. And, if you're waiting for the USDA to give you the right information, understand that the USDA is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Okay? So they are basically beholding to the interests of big agriculture. And, where they tell you to eat 11 servings of grains a day, where do you think that comes from? Certainly not human history. There's no human people group that has ever eaten a diet that remotely resembles anything that the USDA pyramid suggests as optimal. So the idea is to start thinking foundationally. And one of the things that I love about the Paleolithic approach to things, for me, it's a critical starting point, because human beings have, evolved over the last 3.2 or so million years. And during the course of our time on this planet, we have had access to certain things as sources of food. And whatever it was that we had access to are largely just logically and rationally. Those are the things that established our nutritional requirements. Those are the things that established our physiological makeup. So the more closely we can stick to what our ancient ancestors would have seen as food, the more naturally our body's going to be able to make use of those things. And anything that was introduced more recently, say within the last 10,000 years, is going to be something that just by logic, your body is going to be less well adapted to. We've had agriculture now from 0.4% of our entire evolutionary history, and we've only changed maybe genetically, maybe 0.05% in that same amount of time. And by the way, within that same window, we've actually lost 10% of our brain volume. It started declining very rapidly after we started adopting grains. So, we need to, I think, the more foundationally you can think about this, the easier it becomes. If you can, pick up a piece of what somebody's trying to call food and say, well, would my distant ancestor have thought of this as food or not? Cardboard box and, fine print and, little warnings and all natural on the label or whatever else. If it's in a cardboard box, chances are it's not something your ancestor would have seen as would have recognized as food. And that's all I'm saying. Stick to whole natural foods, organic wherever possible, because you're less apt to get genetically modified things in there. You're less apt to get pesticides in there and things that could be potentially toxic to you. And when it comes to the animals, again, animals that we normally think of as our food animals all had their humble beginnings eating what was natural for them to eat, which was basically green grass. And they're designed to live out in fresh air and sunshine and eat a diet of green grass. And what we've done, again, something that U.S. Department of Agriculture, also supports, is we've taken cows out of the pasture. At some point, they get taken out of the pasture and they get thrown into a congested feedlot and fed a lot of grains and things that they weren't designed to eat either. And they're chock full of, gum wrappers and cement dust and all kinds of other things too that get their weight up, and shot full of hormones and antibiotics. And none of these things are natural. And so the quality of the meat that we consume depends entirely on the quality and the health of the animal that meat came from. And that's something else we need to start thinking about. Because you can have two steaks side by side that might look like steak, but the one from the grass-fed animal, that's actually going to have more omega-3s per gram than a piece of wild salmon might have. And the one that came from the feedlot might not have any. Mm-hmm. So, and it may have a whole lot of traces of other things you wouldn't want to be putting in your body or your child's body.
It's all about understanding that quality, understanding where the food is coming from, and just getting back to basics. I love that, Nora. And where can folks get more information? What I love about what you do is you do not hesitate to call a spade a spade. When I think Nora is gonna tell you the truth, and whether or not you like that or not, that's what you're gonna get, and that's what I love. And where can people learn more truth?
Well, they can. You can come to my website, which is www.primalbody-primalmind.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. And the name of my book also is Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life, and that's available. Both you can click the link on my website to find my book. You can also find it's in all the bookstores. It's on Amazon. There aren't too many places where you can't find it. But that book represents better than 10, 15 years worth of my life and my research. And yes, you can trust me to tell you the truth.
I love it, Nora. Well, thank you so much. What's next for you? What's on the horizon?
Well, I'm about to go out to Spokane, Washington. I'll be speaking at the Become Superhuman live event.
Ben Greenfield's conference?
By Ben Greenfield, yes. Nice. And immediately following that, I'll be going down to Paleo FX in Austin, Texas. I have actually a number of speaking engagements this year, which includes some things locally. I'll also be going to speak yet again. I was in Australia last year where I spoke at 3 universities. I'll also be speaking at the Mind Foundation Forum in Sydney, Australia in May. I'll be doing some online summit types of appearances. There's also a traditional diet symposium happening in Vermont in mid-June. And let's see. I may possibly be attending the Ancestral Health Symposium at Emory University in August, and I'll also be speaking in New Zealand in October. So no rest for the weary here. That on top of a full-time private practice here in Portland, Oregon. So
goodness. Well, when you come up to Spokane, if you're coming through Seattle at all, you should let me know. We could grab some high fructose corn syrup and grass-fed beef. Yeah, just kidding.
Yeah, sounds real. A couple of Coca-Colas.
Yeah. Awesome, Nora. That sounds awesome. Well, it sounds like you've got a really exciting year planned, and I really encourage everyone. If you don't do anything else, go to Primal Body Primal Mind. Grab a copy of Nora's books, and just to wet your whistle, check out that there's a link there that says top 10 nutritional mistakes, which you should literally print out and put on your wall because it is just fabulous. So Nora, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. You've been very, very kind and very generous, and it's an honor to be here.
Oh, well, thank you, Nora. Hey, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's show. And again, please do go check out Nora's work. Just an awesome teller of truth. Definitely something I wholeheartedly recommend. And we'll see you next week. And while you're at it, remember to eat more and exercise less, but be sure to do that smarter.